Let me thank you for that nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you for letting me be here today. And I have to tell you, I am absolutely, completely unprepared for what it is I'm going to say. So this is potluck. We'll see where it takes us. Let us start off by saying how pleased I am to be here, as unprepared as I am. Phil Crane, you all know who Phil Crane is, a total disreputable character. Caught me on the floor and said, Dick, I'd like to have you go give one of the Ashbrook lectures. And so I said, well, what's it all about? He explained to me. It turns out I know most of the people on the board, have a tremendous affection for Phyllis Schlafly, and still am curious as how she allowed herself to be included with such a group of reprobates as I've seen with the rest of the board. Especially Phil Crane and Walter Williams, but the more he talked about it, the more I wanted to come. And then I said, well, Phil, what should I talk about? He said, well, why don't you talk about international economics? I said, Phil, I am the one person I can think of that is least qualified to talk on that subject. He says, I know that. But he says, I have to find some way to make my talk look good, and I've decided to get you talking on something. Well, let me talk about that for a moment. I am an economist by trade, and I am a free market economist by the 20 years of accumulated evidence. Like Thomas Sowell, I do not have faith in the market, I have evidence. And I live, after years of observation, by Armey's axiom, number one, the market's rational, the government's dumb. And I've seen very little evidence to refute that. Now, I'd like to relate that, and then I would like to also relate what I think was one of the greatest intellectual debates in the history of economic thought that relates to what I see happening in the world economy today. And that was the great debate between Oscar Lange, the creator of scientific socialism, and Ludwig von Mises, over whether or not it was possible to have a rational economic, a socialist economic system. Now, you must understand that when a real, well-trained economist uses the word rational, he does not mean, as John Kenneth Galbraith does, agree with me. He means rational as if rationing, the achievement of allocative efficiency within the fundamental economic problem of dealing with scarcity by allocating these scarce resources among competing ends. So this is what the debate was about. Lange was very ingenious, and he argued, and I think quite appropriately so, that the only way a socialist-type system could be rational would be if it emulated capitalism effectively. And he's quite correctly so. His argument then, conceptually going on, was that a effective emulation of capitalism would focus on the price system. And that indeed, if you allowed freedom of commercial intercourse, both on the buying and the selling side, and the socialist planners simply controlled the price, that by doing so, they could effect a rational allocation of competing means among, limited means among competing ends, with the state determining what should be the priority in terms of outcomes. And then all the allocative mechanism of the market would be there free to work, with the signal system being controlled by the central planners. And von Mises never quarreled conceptually with Lange. But his point was very succinct and to the point that even so, conceptually, this could work. The problem that the Central Planning Commission would have is they could not possibly collect, fragment, collate, distribute, disseminate, analyze all the data necessary in order to achieve a rational price system. That in fact the real miracle of the market is that it is the greatest information processing system in the world because it collects all the data, sorts all the data, and then disseminates the data on a need-to-know basis. I, for example, know nothing about the cost of inputs, the production process cost, the labor cost, the capital cost for the shoe industry. I've not gone to the market and asked for that information. It's readily available to me if I want it, but I am free to not have to deal with that. Now let me tell you about campaign fundraising. The market has given me all the information I know, including every conceivable reason why somebody cannot give me their money, but enough reasons why they can for me to continue to stay in operation. And the market has helped me to sort this out. And it's given me the information I need for my enterprise and the freedom to reject information for other enterprises. Now, it seems to me that what we see happening in the world economy today is that in the real world, where real people have had to live with the real consequences of their real ideas, you have a realization that von Mises was correct, that no matter how good your model of socialism, communism, or central planning, it cannot be made to work, that it is doomed to failure, because the information demands are so great that it is simply not possible. And you have people vacating that model and striving to understand and to institute this thing called markets. And that is what you see dominating the intellectual activities of virtually every nation in the world except our nation. Seems like it's the old adage is what you have the least of is what you value the most. And since we have the least slavery of any nation in the world, our academics and our intellectuals tend to value that. So they continue to be preoccupied with how can we get more of our hands on more of the levers of the economy and control it more to the outcome configurations that are most satisfying to us. But everyone else, I had two Russian economists in my office the other day, wanted to talk about economics. I asked them if they'd ever heard of Lange, and they had not. And I said, well, let me tell you about Lange's model of scientific socialism, trying to sort of warm up to the subject of capitalism. They said, oh, we don't want to hear about socialism. We've heard all that we want. We want to hear about capitalism. Well, what is capitalism? What people are discovering is capitalism is a very simple, fundamental thing. It is individual freedom, not corporate freedom, not institutional control, individual freedom. Every market transaction boils down to two people making a bilateral transaction where each acts on their own self-interest, trading away that which they value less for that which they value more. And it's freedom. All that is required for a market to work is for the people who would preempt it to have a lack of faith in either the ability or the integrity of the trading partners. And that they should then also have the presumptiveness to believe that they then could have greater control over efficiency, inequity, and outcomes. Now, where they have tried this, they've seen it fail. So they're struggling for freedom of markets, freedom of access to markets. And one of the things that I think is most surprising to people like myself is that freedom is a very difficult thing to learn for people who've never experienced it. We think that all we got to do is break up the despotic control mechanism, and that freedom just sort of takes off on its own. But these nations, states, are groping for the kind of institutional structure within which the freedom can be worked out. While we, on the other hand, in our country, continue to have a political process that is dominated by a desire to repress the freedom of the individual, the rights of the individual, and to endow the institution of government with more power over the lives of individuals. And it strikes me as rather strange that we have so much difficulty watching the whole world trying to emulate what we have here while we continue to try to dismantle our system. Now, why is that? Is it that we don't know any? When I first went to Washington, I had a very saintly attitude. I looked at the aberrant behavior of my colleagues. Incidentally, I practiced what I called public choice theory in the university in my last days in the university. Public choice theory I describe as the study of the aberrant behavior of people in public office. And I watched this aberrance, and I did so with a tremendous kindness and tolerance. And I said to myself, as the Lord did on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Told my good friend Ron Dellums, I said, Ron, I understand you've got a master's degree in social work from Berkeley that you got in the 60s. You never had a chance to know any better. And I said, you and I are fundamentally the same, Ron. I said, I spend that money like it's my money, and you spend that money like it's my money. But I realized after several years it is not that. Our intellectual left wing of American politics that is trying to control the economy and the individual then within the economy is not doing so because they honestly believe that by their control they can generate a greater outcome for all people. That, frankly, is a matter of very little interest to them. And I think the saddest thing that I have discovered while I was in Washington is that they're really in it for themselves. The question is, how much do I improve my circumstance if I have the power vested in my hands? And here we have the situation where the people of our country don't understand the dangers. A good friend of mine, Dr. Chen Sun, the now president of National Taiwan University, looked at me very seriously one day when we were graduate school students together, and he said, Dick, he said, the problem with you Americans is you don't know how evil the communists are. And our problem is we don't know how evil the economics control are at whatever degree we find it. And therefore we allow it to continue to grow against the lives of our grandchildren, while current, short-sighted, self-serving politicians continue to grab up more of the levers and take away the system. Now, in the other nation states across the globe, the people who have endured the loss and are the grandchildren that lost their future for the revolution that their grandparents won at another time, understood and reject. So we have this amazing transformation. I wonder where it's going to go. We see it show up now in more mundane ways in our life and perhaps more highly visible. Should there be an extension of a new GATT round where we have a freer opening of the marketplace? Let me say that I'm for free trade in every dimension of it. And let me say that the conflict that we see going on in the world can be described by what I call the full anatomy of the political economy. And let me finish with that, and then perhaps we'll go to questions. Adam Smith gave us the invisible hand, and we all love the analogy, right? How many of you know the analogy of the invisible hand? Well, I'll go through it then. Adam Smith, let's start with Adam Smith. And let me give you the full anatomy of the political economy with the right side first, right? The anatomy begins with the invisible hand of the market, as Adam Smith said, where each and every individual acting in their own self-interest is guided as if by an invisible hand to that behavior, that activity, which best serves the general interest of the group. That's the market. Then there is also the visible foot of the market. And we most often hear about the visible foot when the liberals in our community who are trying to get their hands on another lever bemoan the number of business failures we have. The market allocates resources away from losers and to winners. Market punishes incompetence and it punishes immorality. It finds it out quickly and it deals with it decisively. So if you're incompetent or if you're immoral, that is to say lie, steal, or cheat, people will not do business with you and the market will kick you out. That is the visible foot of the market. Then you have the invisible, on the left side of the anatomy, you have the invisible foot of the government, where the government kicks us around. That is to say, when we put in a new, higher acreage, I may say base price for the wheat farmers here, everybody says, isn't that wonderful? That's the visible hand of the government, right? Government's helping out here. And we got 5, 6 people here saying, boy, this is great. And they rejoice in it, right? But the rest of us are getting kicked around by the invisible foot. We don't see it so clearly because we're the ones that are paying the taxes for that subsidy. When the government says we're going to define this group of people as having a higher social relative deservingness than that group of people, and we will extend their rights beyond what is normal, reasonable, fair treatment, but you give to them special privilege, they're kicking around this group of people. And what I'm saying is people who are short-sighted, who are intellectually weak, emotionally weak, and who are greedy and self-serving will tend to see only that part of the political economy's anatomy that is visible. That is to say, they see the visible foot of the market and think of it as destructive, and they see the visible hand of the government and think of it as helpful. And that ability to see only what is visible is very comforting for those people who have it in their own self-interest to have less freedom and more power, so long as the power is invested with me. Now, those people who are more farsighted, perhaps have been more long-suffering, and who are more intellectually and emotionally courageous, will have the ability to see what is not visible. And they then will see the invisible hand of the market and the invisible foot of the government, and they will reject it. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that the world has seen the full anatomy of the political economy very clearly, except for our country, for us back home. And we have not seen the full repercussions of this. So what we have is a world that's rushing to free markets with the United States that should be the natural leader in the process being the anchor in the albatross that we drag along. And I think it's a crying shame that we, who should show the way by virtue of our own accomplishment, are the naysayers in this wonderful change. When I say wonderful change, I'm saying wonderful for regular, ordinary, never identified, never known, real people that will show up all over the nation. And the reason this is so critical is, as I said before, for those who have not experienced it, freedom can only be learned. And it will not be well taught by people who question it in their own experience. So if we are then not the teachers, the revolution may not take place. And certainly GATT is a place to begin. The fair trade agreement with, or the joint trade agreement with Mexico is a place to begin. But it's really got to begin more in an acceptance for ourselves of the blessings of liberty, which, remember, is what the Constitution's, I believe the preambles, Peter will help me out. Isn't that what it was all about? We were supposed to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. And we've not understood that. So that's what I see going on in the world market, the world economy. The market will, in the final analysis, define the outcome, even against efforts to deny it or control it. It cannot be denied. Everybody knows that, except us. And yet we've had the greatest opportunity to know it of any nation in the history of the world. I don't know why that happens, but I know that we cannot enjoy the benefits of this new world if it doesn't happen. Thank you. And maybe I can respond to questions. I will take any question on any subject and give you an answer. The only guarantee that I will give is that I will believe the response to be true and candid. If it is inaccurate, it will be error, not deception.
What will happen to Gorbachev and Russia? How are they going to bring in the free market?
Question is, what will happen to Gorbachev in Russia? Will they bring in a free market? You see, I think that's what you see is the struggle to learn freedom, the insecurity. We have had Russian immigrants that have come here and have become so depressed and confused with all our freedom that they've gone back. They didn't know how to cope with it. And I couldn't predict the outcome of what will happen in the Soviet Union. I know I have a lot of good friends like Richard Round, who spends a lot of time in Eastern Europe trying to help teach the skills of freedom to the institutional leaders of the countries. But I think it's a very risky thing. I don't think it is very helpful to have American intellectuals telling folks that you're going in the wrong direction and reinforcing the critics. I mean, people who would like to see the whole experiment in the Soviet Union fail are people who want to get their hands back on the levers, back in control. Well, the question was, would I assess Dick Gebhardt's ability or probability of assessing the Mexican trade agreement? First thing you got to understand, I'm going to tell you, I said I'd be candid. Dick Gebhardt is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the AFL-CIO. You must understand that. And that may offend some of you for me to say that, but some of you may say it's not true, but I believe it to be true. And so you have to understand that, in effect, he's a mouthpiece here for the AFL-CIO. And they have a lot of leverage in Congress. It's hard for me to imagine that they can't get their votes together. For us to do fast track requires an affirmative action from Congress, and that worries me. So it's going to be very difficult. So I would say that he's got, you understand, you must understand, this is the thing that hurts me and was hard for me to finally accept. We're not talking about people that are making public policy for serious purposes regarding the destiny and outcomes that their children live with. We're talking about people deciding their next 2 or 4 years of political outcome. And unless we accept that that is what governs the behavior of these folks in Washington, we will never understand nor predict what they will do. And in Washington, money talks, and nobody talks as effectively with their money as the AFL-CIO. That is to say, either as a carrot or a stick. So you have to be pessimistic, quite frankly. My fundamental rule for predicting outcomes in the U.S. Congress has been, and I've developed this over my first early years of observation, if I can determine that an outcome will be detrimental to the freedom and dignity and prosperity of my children, I can predict that it will pass the U.S. House of Representatives. And that formula, unhappily, rarely lets me down. Because the majority of the majority is governed by a very self-serving, small clique of special interests that leverage particularly their money, extremely well in the process. And it is a vision that I believe to be contrary to the best interest of my children. So it is a frightening place on occasion. Yes.
President Bush's peace-based policy and the Canadian and Pacific Mexican trade pact, what do you see in the future for economic and employment opportunities to go forward in this nation?
Well, one of the things that we always have to understand, I mean, every smart guy in Washington keeps trying to rewrite the history of the 80s. The 80s were, from an economic point of view, especially by comparison with the 60s and the 70s, an enormous success. And it showed that whereas Jimmy Carter verbalized the days of national malaise and the Democrats' main book in the 70s was Zero-Sum Society, said growth ends forever. The economy has an enormous ability to generate jobs and opportunities and so forth if we don't sabotage it with bad public policy. I think the president has a fairly clearly defined vision of economic policy with respect to international trade because he's interested in international relations. He doesn't have a very clearly defined concept of domestic economic policy, as witness the outcome of the summit deal last year and what is reputed to be his stand. We don't know that it is, but what's reputed to be his stand on such things as rolling back the FICA tax. So that we think that the president will work for opening trade at every juncture. And I just think that he's got a very recalcitrant Congress, and that since what is required to be done requires that Congress do something sensible and responsible first before the president can sign it, it's going to be a very difficult job.
The
Well, the question was on term limitations. What do I think the prospects are? You were very kind. The gentleman was very kind. He didn't ask me what I think of them. He asked me what I thought the prospects were for them. I may not like politics, but I know how to do it. If you give me a way off the hook, I'll grab it. I don't think you're ever going to have term limitations because Congress would have to vote them. You know, I quite frankly don't. I'm going to go ahead and take the hook anyway because nobody votes in my district. I can be honest here, I'm not back in my district. I don't support the idea of term limitations. I don't think that, and I'm disappointed in Republicans for advancing the argument. I don't think that it's very Republican of us to try to solve our political problem by diminishing your rights as voters. And that's what I think that does. But I don't think it's going to happen anyway. We're going to have all kinds of mysticism. You know, Congress does a wonderful job of feigning responsibility. And we're going to have a big show about campaign reform. And, you know, Armey's axiom is anytime Congress passes a piece of legislation that has the word reform in the title, you must ask yourself what is being taken away from the American people. That's with the Budget Reform Act and so forth. They will change the campaign laws and they'll make a big show about how, boy, we're making this a responsible process, and they will put the challenger at an even greater disadvantage and themselves at an even greater advantage. You just can't trust these folks, I'm telling you. I mean, my mama taught me that when I was a boy. She said, don't trust anyone who says I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And it's kind of a shame. It is kind of a shame. It's been very disillusioning for me. I mean, I don't mean to say that there aren't some real wonderful people in the House. And even the people that I most disagree with. I don't talk in terms of individual aberrants. I talk about institutional aberrants. Jim Wright, for example, did some terribly, terribly outrageous things, some things that were very badly illegal. He didn't do them for Jim Wright. He didn't hold up the S&L industry to fill Jim Wright's campaign coffers. He did them because he had an institutional role within the Democrat caucus to be the primary fundraiser. Because they had given him the privilege of being the speaker, he had to respond by fulfilling his obligation to be their fundraiser. And that's why he was digging around in the S&L pockets the way he was. It's an institutional aberrance. And he got himself caught. Now, of course, the point of the matter is, if in fact Armey's axiom is correct that politics will sooner or later make a fool out of everybody, then your choice is to say, I give up political ambition. If you give it up, then you're free. And that's what I did. But if you don't, then you end up with these kinds of problems. So, yes. I do not think it would be beneficial for our country to limit the terms of the members of Congress, quite frankly. I do think it would be beneficial for our country if one of our two great political parties, namely the Republicans, would become less inept at politics. Conservatives, and the Republican Party tends to be dominated by conservatives, as the Democrat Party tends to be dominated by liberals. Conservatives think of politics as distasteful. You know, and I think it's distasteful business for me to sit down and work up a personnel veto. I don't like writing. How many of you enjoy writing a resume? It's a dirty, rotten job, isn't it? But if you don't write the resume, you don't get the job. And that's what politics is in this process. And the conservatives in general, and particularly Republican conservatives, are inept at politics. Now, a two-party system working with the kind of one party checking against the other presumes a certain level of competence on the part of both parties doing what parties do, which is politics. Politics being putting people in a position where they can define public policy by virtue of that shared vision as opposed to the other shared vision that defines the other party. And if there's been anybody, in my estimation, that's let the nation down, it's been the Republicans for their political ineptness. And this would not be a question if it were not the case. And you can't blame the Democrats. They're doing what we all do. How many of you today go to work for some reason other than taking care of yourself and your family? Is there anybody here? I mean, politicians are very good at feigning altruism. I understand that. And you know that I am working for high ideals. So all those other guys you got to watch. All right. But the fact of the matter is that Democrats are doing. When Jim Wright said that I will use any parliamentary procedure available to assure a Democrat victory, I didn't take offense to that. I said, you know, he's going to use every sleazy trick I'd use if my party were in office and I were the speaker, because his vision means that much to him. And we haven't, on our side, been willing to be as ruthless in support of the opportunity to represent our vision that the other side has been. So, yes.
How would you explain the success of the Japanese economy when it appears that there's a great deal of public policy levers being deployed in that economy?
Well, yeah, one of the things I always like to remind people is that one should not presume that the Japanese economy government is any smarter than the American government. And you shouldn't think in terms of the Japanese government having done so much to help the Japanese business. I think, quite frankly, what the Japanese government has done is it has taken a position to try to encourage their business by representing their business in world markets and by minimizing barriers against that they do. For example, I believe they have I think they have a zero capital gains tax, don't they, in Japan? Generally speaking, to take the position that would be encouraging, and of course to keep competition out, to give them a sort of an infant industry, closed environment to grow up in. Now take a look at where our problem is and ask yourself, what has our government done to our business? We have a government that takes the presumption that if a business is successful, it must be corrupt. Is that not correct? And that therefore we must punish success, because success means profits, and everyone knows profits can only be obtained through evil activity. I mean, this is the mentality of our government. And therefore we enact such things as my favorite. I think one of the most all-time great dumb pieces of legislation, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is, to say we're going to take our idea of what is business morality and impose it on you no matter where you're doing business. And our excessive taxes on profits. Remember that one? I always loved that one. The obscene profits against which we impose the excessive profits tax. Our government is just plain goofy in its hostility towards business success. By comparison, then, we have one of the most imperative problems facing any economic system is the allocation of scarce capital. So what do? We set, with borrowed money, we put up something we call the Small Business Administration. And this is the way it works. If you can, remember, they're borrowing the money to provide us with this great service. If you can prove to the Small Business Administration that you have a business proposition and a plan that has been turned down by 3 bankers for its lack of feasibility, you can qualify for a loan. That is to say, where the market punishes failure, we got a government that says you've got to be able to prove you will fail before we will underwrite it. Now, Armey's axiom is that nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as they spend their own. And then the add-on to that I come up with just recently, looking at such things as the SBA, is if it's true that a fool and his money is soon parted, it's even more true that a fool and somebody else's money is soon parted. Now, but you have to understand, nobody ever thought the SBA ought to be there for an economic policy purpose. See where I go wrong? I'm thinking this is an economic policy. This is a social policy. The problem is that we have an political economic system that doesn't do enough for failures. And so the government's got to do some way to come in here and subsidize the failures. And if you think that somehow that's goofy, then you are, of course, social Darwinist. So, I mean, the labels. It's incredible. So, I think, quite frankly, what you have to say, the Japanese people are an entrepreneurially very quick people. They're a very industrious people. And they knew from the outset, given, of course, that they had a chance to totally reconstruct their economy after World War II with our help, they knew at the outset they had to survive in world markets. We didn't know that. We're just learning that with the reconstruction of Germany, the reconstruction of Japan, and the emergence of the third world. We're just learning that there's a world economy out there that we don't dominate. So we have very, very poor international trade skills, where theirs are very well honed. Do I go on too long?
Not at all.
I'm still open for any. There's a young lady here. What should the Republican Party do? Punt? Hey, I'm not depressed. I'm about the happiest guy I know. If you buy that, just remember I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. I think the Republican Party ought to decide. Is our vision that we would like to serve? You see, there's a fundamental difference. We want to serve a vision, and the liberals want to enforce a vision. And that's a big difference. But is our vision important enough to us that we're willing to be ruthless to see to it that that governs our children? The liberal says, is my vision important enough to me that I'm willing enough to be ruthless to see that I govern everybody's children? And that is a fundamental difference. So they got zeal, right? The words, the most meaningful words to the left are the words you owe it to yourself. Man, they come out swinging because that's who they're working for. And unless we understand that. But what does the left tell? If you hear the folklore of American politics is that conservatives are greedy, conservatives are heartless, conservatives don't care, right? Is this the folklore of American politics? Why? Because the left has not been unwilling to indict us with epithets. We are too well-mannered. You know, Armey's axiom is that the politics agreed are wrapped in the language of love. And the left wing of American politics has captured the language of love. And they put it together in a bureaucratic, sort of symbiotic, rhetorical relationship with the 6 talking professions. And so the language of love is dominated, or the language of our social political culture is dominated by left-wing people talking the language of love, pretending to be altruistic while they're serving their own interests, and we don't call their hand on it. Now, I should have said, had I been a well-mannered conservative, I should have said, Dick Gephardt is a statesman, you know. You see, I shouldn't have said, you know, he's owned lock, stock, and barrel by the AFL-CIO. Why don't you know that? Because we don't tell it. It's our job. Have you found a left-winger that was reluctant to tell you about Dick Armey being so heartless he's against civil rights? I mean, have you not heard? I happen to be for civil rights and against hiring quotas. But you got the buzzword blackmail. So the problem is, this is what now, about a president. I have to tell you, I love Ronald Reagan like a father, but I was awful disappointed to him, and I'm somewhat disappointed in George Bush. The American people love Ronald Reagan. He should have taken that love that we had for him and beaten the Democrats up with it. Beaten up on the left wing of American politics. Now, please understand, I hate to sound so partisan. Not all the left, well, I mean, I do, because not all the left-wingers are in the Democrat Party, and not, you know, and it is not a party devoid of its own right wing. But the liberal majority of the majority that dominates the behavior of Congress needed to be more challenged by Ronald Reagan and needs to be more challenged by George Bush. What good is it to have our guy, that is to say, our vision represented by a person in the executive branch who thinks their job is to appease the left? It just doesn't work. You know, American politics are dull. Is it that dull across the globe? No. Well, you know, I watch the English Parliament. They get into it, don't they? What do we say? The gentleman will please forgive me, but let me respectfully suggest that he might be a tiny bit near. British is up. You're lying. Well, there makes a big difference. We don't did that. We ought to do that. They are lying, and they're doing it on purpose, and we ought to be willing to say so. And if we're not, then we have to ask ourselves, do our children deserve better than what they're getting from us? You know, because I'm not going to live under my vision. The left already has in place today a vision that's hostile to my children. I will, the best I can do will not make it possible for me to live under my vision. So I cannot work for myself. If I were a left-winger and my vision was that I should have more power over your life, then I can immediately live under my vision. Right? See what an inspiration that is? I can get what I want right now. I'm working for I don't even like my kids anymore. I don't trust them with my grandchildren, you know? So I'm working for my kids? Yeah, it's pretty hard, you know. They've been living off me all these years. What have they ever put back? But if you're talking about me, give me the power now, then I got inspiration to go to work every day. And that's why the left-wingers are better at politics than we are. Their goal is very immediate and is very, well, it's both immediate with respect to time and person. And we're working for something that's more abstract. So, I do love my children, by the way.
Congressman, congressional spending is at an all-time high. The budget that just came out is like 27% of the GNP, and it doesn't look like it's going to ever slow down. What's the prognosis?
The only chance we got for controlling congressional spending is to get a good internecine war going in Congress that breaks down on something other than partisan basis. And I think we can do that. I've kind of reckoned it up in my mind. If I can take a minute, I'd like to share this concept with you. There are two kinds of pork. All congressional spending is pork. Understand that. Some of it does good and necessary things. We do appreciate that. But how exactly it is spent is pork. That is to say, I know we're going to buy so many weapons to defend our nation, and to do so is a necessary thing. But it's more necessary that the weapons be bought in my district than your district. And that's where the pork comes in. So we have two kinds of pork. One is what I call low-profile partisan pork. And that is the entitlement spending. Lyndon Baines Johnson's great contribution to American politics was that he taught the National Democrat Party the politics agreed. He did. And that, they called it the Great Society, of course, because they always feign altruism. They weren't doing it for themselves, they were doing it for other folks. But what did you do? You take a look at all of the spending increase in the federal government since the Johnson years has been in the low-profile partisan pork that we call entitlements. And that accrues to the party. Every Democrat sort of feeds off that. Republicans are always the naysayers that didn't want to put that wonderful housing program in there. Remember how heartless they were? And then they didn't understand about the evils of the absentee landlord. The problem was Republicans understood that if the government is the absentee landlord, you got the most negligent one of all. That's why we were against it. We had what I call, Armey's axiom is that compassion without understanding is cruel. We had understanding. But at any rate, so what's happening is that the individual office holder gets very little out of this. Claude Pepper lived on it until he died, and some of the others are kind of living off some of it. Sonny Montgomery's still living off veterans programs, but by and large, this kind of pork doesn't do much for the individual member of Congress. The individual member of Congress gets all of their power rewards out of what I call high-profile, individualized pork. And that's what you see coming out of the Public Works Committee, out of the Appropriations Committees, out of the Armed Services Committee, to some extent the Agriculture Committee, right? Where you got these guys that fought to get on that program. I fought to get on that committee so that I could have the leverage over my colleagues of saying, yes, I will, or no, I won't support the dam in your project. Because if I carry this bucket of water for you, that dam, that waterway, that road project, then you're going to owe me. And I got leverage in the process. Now, these guys that all sought out these power positions for the high-profile individualized pork are within the current budget circumstance getting squeezed out. Because entitlement spending is out of control, it's on automatic pilot, and it's on a constant increase. Now, what we're trying to do is to work with these guys and say, never mind what your party loyalties are. If you don't take on this whole question of entitlement reform and force the issue on entitlement reform, you're going to end up with a throne and no power, that you'll be squeezed out of the budget. Now, you got your high-profile partisan pork, individual pork is now, I believe, 30% of the entire budget. They've squeezed it down to only 30% of it gets put out on the dole on a sort of a give me my credit today basis. So, but they still have enough power so that, and enough allegiance in the body at large so that, hey, I'd rather be on Jim's side in the appropriators than Dan Rostenkowski. You see? So if we can create that kind of internecine warfare and we can make it break down on something other than partisan lines, I think we can make a very disruptive impact in the process and perhaps force some entitlement reform, which is the only way you're ever going to control the spending. I know I've gone on too long. I want to thank you for putting up with me. I hope it's been worth your while, and I do. Again, thank you for letting me be a part of this.